This is the Chapter 9 portion of Exam 3 review. A general overview of Chapter 9 is shown here on this slide. We talked about why government intervenes. There are two theories, the public interest theory and the special interest group theory. So go back and look at your notes and know the difference between those two theories. And then we talked about the types of intervention: public goods, externalities, regulations, antitrust laws, public provision of health care, and redistribution. So you want to look at those topics. I'm going to give you a little additional detail on externalities, regulations, antitrust laws, and redistribution, because those are some things that are a little more complex. Public goods, you should know what they are. Go back and look at your notes. And public provision of health care, that's a little more straightforward. On externalities, I wanted to show you some examples of positive externalities and negative externalities, remind you what's going on there. An externality, you should know the definition of what an externality is. It's when an organization, the parties that are involved in the transaction do not bear all the costs or receive all the benefits. So here's an example of a positive externality where the individuals buying something don't necessarily receive all of the benefits. And so the example that we often use in healthcare about a positive externality would be vaccines. So the first demand curve, the one that's down and to the left, is the demand curve that contains the marginal personal benefit. That is, say I am perhaps a low-income mother without health insurance, and so I have to pay out of pocket for vaccines, and I'm thinking about, so I don't have insurance blurring things, I'm thinking about, should I pay for this vaccine for my kid, or should I buy something a little nicer for dinner this week? And the money that I don't spend on vaccines, I could spend on other things. And so I have to make those budgetary decisions. And when I'm thinking about benefits versus costs, I think about the benefit of having my kid protected from measles, mumps, and rubella. I don't think about the fact that if my kid and 80% of the kids around him all have this vaccine, then that creates a herd immunity and will protect other kids who maybe are immunocompromised and can't get a vaccine. So that's a societal benefit that I totally ignore when I'm deciding about whether I get my own kid vaccinated. So as a society, when we include those additional benefits, the demand from society, which includes all of the individual benefits plus those greater societal benefits, that demand is the demand curve that's up and to the right. And so if we were driven by that demand, we would see an increase in price and quantity. So P1 and Q1, I forgot to put the 1 on the Q there on the graph. P1 and Q1 are our optimal, socially optimal consumption and price. Whereas without any government intervention, we would end up at Q0 and P0. The negative externality example that I used in class, I think, was pollution. And that is here's an example where there's a negative externality in production. The marginal personal cost of production is the supply curve that's below the lower one, labeled supply MPC, marginal personal cost. And so that would be from the perspective of the firm. I'm thinking about all the cost of production of the thing that I'm manufacturing, but I'm not counting the impact of the smoke going up my smokestacks, because that pollution doesn't affect my production costs at all. I don't have to count the societal cost of having pollution affecting the kids nearby and increasing their asthma rates and things like that. But if I include the cost of pollution and everything it does, that is the marginal social cost. It includes both the personal cost of the firm and the additional societal costs that the firm doesn't recognize. And so if we were looking at where the supply and demand curve cross when we include all of the costs, including the social costs not recognized by the firm, we see a smaller quantity and a higher price. We move from Q0 to Q1 and P0 to P1. So one of the ways to deal with this is to encourage a positive externality with some kind of a subsidy, and a negative externality, take care of a negative externality by some kind of tax. And so here's an example where I want to give a subsidy, and I'm going to give it, this example is health insurance being tax-free. So if I think about the marginal personal benefit of having insurance and how that benefits me, that's that first demand that I've labeled MPB. I forgot the D, I see. And then when I include the social benefit of having a healthy workforce and having my kids have health insurance and be healthy so they can attend school and be more productive workers in the future, and all of the things that make healthcare coverage better for society. That's the MSB. And so I'd rather see consumption at Q1 and with a price of P1 rather than consumption at Q0 with a price of P0. So how do I get the individual to move their consumption up to Q1? Well, first of all, if I wanted to move the insurance company's supply up to Q1, I'd have to pay P1, right? Because the insurance company is not going to provide that many policies unless I pay P1. But the consumers are only going to take their own benefit into account, so they would only be at that quantity, they'd only be willing to pay P2. So what we need to do is subsidize that price P1. The difference between P1 and P2 has to become a subsidy so that the seller gets all of P1, but the buyer doesn't have to pay more than P2. And that, if you get that done, then you will move consumption up to Q1. And so we subsidize the price, and the subsidy should be the difference between P1 and P2. I wanted to give you an overview of regulation again. We talked about 3 points under regulation. The first one was because quality is often not measurable from the perspective of the consumer in healthcare, we have licensing in place to assure that the hospitals are well built, that doctors are well educated, and so on. So licensing is an important thing. When we are requiring the producers of a medical service to be licensed, that increases their cost of production, and it reduces the number of providers in the market. And so you see that supply curve moving back from S0 to S1. But because quality is higher and the consumer has more confidence in it, it increases demand from D0 to D1. So originally we saw the D0 and S0 supply and demand cross at quantity Q0 with price P0. But after licensing, when we see a reduction in supply and an increase in demand, we know our price goes up, and that I've marked that at P1 where the new supply and demand intersect. Where the quantity falls, whether it's higher than Q0 or lower than Q0, it really depends on the relative amount of movement between D1 and S1. We always know price goes up, but quantity could be a little bit lower or a little bit higher depending on what the relative movements are. Another thing under regulation that we do is granting monopoly power to encourage research and development, and we think about that in terms of pharmaceuticals. If you develop a new drug, you get a patent, which grants monopoly power, and so that's the reward for a drug firm for doing that R&D. I don't think we need to expand on that much. We talked about is price regulation, and we'll touch on this again in Chapter 13, but under price regulation, the government decides, maybe in an effort to keep costs down, they're just going to state what the price is. We're going to say, look, we can't afford what the market price is. It's got to be 10% lower. So here, if we let the market equilibrium happen, we'd end up at Q0, and then for some reason I marked it P1 instead of P0. Sorry about that. But then if the government comes in and says, nope, we're going to have this new price, it's going to be P, I said sub G, for the government's regulated price. And at that lower price, the suppliers are going to only be willing to supply QS, but the consumers are going to, at that price, there's going to be QD demanded. And so you've got more quantity demanded than quantity supplied, and that difference creates a shortage. So the price regulation can hold costs down, but it does create shortages, and so you may have rationing by wait time or something because you're not allowing market to ration through price. We talked about antitrust laws. They're grounded in the Sherman Act of 1890, which prohibits a whole bunch of stuff, so you should know what price fixing, boycotting, market allocation is. Horizontal mergers, and those are regulated by HHI guidelines. Exclusive dealing, tied contracting, most favored nation clause. You should know what all of those are. The rule of reason happens when we've got some kind of an antitrust activity, but there's an argument that there's a social good that comes. So, for example, with a horizontal merger, there's an antitrust issue because the market may become so consolidated that the organization has monopoly power. On the other hand, if there are large economies of scale, maybe the hospital system can operate more efficiently with that large market share. And so as antitrust regulators look at things from situation to situation, they use the rule of reason or some common sense, and they try to balance the argument for social goods that counteract the concerns about the antitrust activity. So there's some rationalization that you could use for exclusive dealing, sometimes for tied contracting. So, go back and look at your notes on that. Redistribution, that's government intervenes because competition will reach efficiency, will get us to efficiency, but it will never get us to equity necessarily. And so government has to intervene to redistribute resources from the wealthy to the poor to make sure that there's more equity. There are two kinds of equity that we talk about. Vertical equity. With vertical equity, the more resources you have, the more you should pay and the less you should receive as a percent of income. So an example of vertical equity is our progressive income tax rates, where as your income goes up, your marginal tax rate goes higher and higher on your income tax. So people who have more can afford to pay more. Horizontal equity is when you look at people who are in the same situation and they should be treated equally. So the Supreme Court decision, the SCOTUS decision about the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion actually violates horizontal equity because you may have one person in one state and another person who is identical to the first guy, but they happen to live in another state, and one has Medicaid and the other one doesn't. That violates horizontal equity. And we talked about tools to achieve redistribution. They can function on the supply side, like encouraging docs to work in underserved areas, perhaps through loan forgiveness programs for their medical school fees, or on the demand side, providing cash transfers to poor consumers. And we talked about SNAP, that is the food stamp program. We talked about welfare. We talked about Medicaid. And so those are ways of transferring, and you can transfer with cash or you can do in-kind transfers, so know the difference between those.